right, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Hello, I am Leslie C. Wester, and I serve as chairperson for the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask the members of the board to respond with a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. David Anderson.
Present.
Donna Horner Quayle. Thank you.
Present.
I'll get it. Mary Jones.
Here.
Jacqueline Lightcap.
Here.
Jonna Norton.
Here.
Bruce Nystrom.
Here.
Andrea Perdomo Morales.
Present.
Laura Shaughnessy.
Here.
Rick Steele.
Here.
Deb Stidham.
Here.
Carolyn Zasfran.
Here.
I know the following staff members are also present: David Fye.
Here.
Leslie Allen.
Here.
Cindy Diorcoli.
Here.
And Ashley Van Buskirk, you said, is not here today.
That's correct.
Okay. Assistant Attorney Generals Lainey Bernard and Jane Weiler are also present. And David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
This is David Fye, Executive Director of the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the board about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act does not require the board to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the Executive Director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There is no public comment at today's meeting, as no individuals requested to provide public comment. Because we're conducting the meeting, public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Access to the meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is being conducted remotely, the requirements of the COMA are not suspended. As such, we will be conducting the meeting pursuant to COMA. On September 20th, 2021, we sent notice of the board's meeting to all individuals that have requested notice of the board's meeting. The notice is also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other meeting materials was posted on the board's website, and it is now reflected on the day of the meeting. You may also request a copy of the agenda by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line "Request for the agenda," and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. Thank you.
The meeting is now called to order, and the board will begin its discussion of the first item on its agenda. So as you all know, we usually at this time would be able to meet in person. We've changed this to the virtual meeting today, so I appreciate you all working with us and getting a schedule together. I know that's sometimes difficult, so thank you for that. The first thing on the agenda would be the agenda approval. Does anyone have anything that they would like to add or have any questions about? Is there a motion for approval?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes. I mean, the agenda.
I'll second, Laura.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we did remove some things. As you noticed at the bottom, we had just had a board meeting and we decided to remove some of the staff reporting and executive director's report because we had just gone over that recently. So thank you for that. All right, let's get right to it. The annual planning discussion topics, the BSRB website posting policy. So Dave, I think you and Lainey had some information for us.
Yeah, and I think most of this conversation, I think, will be a discussion of some draft language that Lainey and Jane have been working on in terms of the board's website posting policy. But in your packet of material, I went ahead and provided the current language of the website posting policy and then another highlighted marked up copy. And so you can kind of see how the language is currently reflected, and then the draft language, which I think Lainey and Jane might walk through. So I want to direct your attention to those, and then I'll kind of defer to them and they can explain what the changes they recommend.
And so what I did, this is Lainey. So what I did after the comments at the last meeting and just the things to provide clarity of the policy to anyone who would be reading it is so that the first sentence, the change in the first sentence, the change there, that language comes from the board's mission policy that's on its website. So that's where that language came from. And then really the only substantial change is after the discussion, taking out the word serious and then outlining specifically what types of things would be posted for clarity. And so then that's the second part there of the first paragraph. And then the only other consideration for the board, if it were to be approved today, would be the effective date. And so that's something for consideration. So this is just the draft that I put together, and Jane reviewed it with me as well, put together for the board's consideration.
So I think the idea was just to clean it up a little bit and just really make it where it's workable.
Yes, and I think it'll help Leslie too in the office, just on clarity as far as what she's doing with what. So hopefully it helps everybody.
Anyone have any comments?
This is Rick. I have a quick question. So this is partially in response, I think, to, maybe I'm wrong. Is this partially in response to a letter that all board members received either in the spring or the summer regarding questions about whether or how much information should be posted on the website? Am I correct in that?
I did what I was requested to do, but my involvement when I became involved in this was, I know we would talk with Leslie just when she would have questions about, what goes on the website and then what goes up to the National Practitioners Data Bank or database. So that's when I stepped into this, but I think the background is just providing clarity to everybody.
Okay.
And just the ease of use.
Yeah, Rick, and I don't know if it's really in response necessarily to that letter. I think maybe there just have been some questions about in general what should get posted, and we've really tried to match it up with what's required by the National Practitioner Database. So I wouldn't say it was necessarily in response to that, but that did happen earlier this year. And I think that just kind of goes to the general issue of there's just been a little bit confusion in terms of what should get posted, and this should help clarify some of that.
And I don't think that changed anything in regards to that letter either. So it's not changing what we put on the website is what I'm seeing anyway.
That's what I was seeing as well. And I was just clarifying, and I think this language is great and it does help clarify. And I appreciate taking out the serious, because what one person considers serious is not necessarily what another person considers serious. And I think it's fine. I was just curious about if there had been, I missed the September 13th meeting and was not sure if there was further discussion about the concerns raised by that licensee, or in that case, former licensee maybe. So.
Yeah, and if I recall right, I think that letter that we received was an anonymous letter, so I don't know that we could really identify who that person was. But yeah, this was kind of separate from that issue. I think that instance raised some questions about why things should be posted on the website, but I think there have been other questions in general about, what should get posted and what the board is following. And so this helps kind of clarify things.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Rick. Anyone else? So would we like to move to approve this, make the changes?
This is Rick. Yeah, I'll second.
Okay. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. All right. Merit the public trust requirement for licensure.
And I will just start the conversation here. In your packet, there is some language in regulation. You have a handout in your packet. The header is merit the public trust. And it shows in statute that in the application for licensure, one of the requirements is has satisfied the board that the applicant is a person who merits public trust. And then in KAR, in this example, 102-7-1, it provides a definition for merit the public trust. And I think earlier this year, there had been a question of, is this something that should remain as a requirement for licensure? Is there perhaps a better language or better definition to get at kind of what this goes at? And so we wanted to include it as a discussion topic for the board. And we also asked our legal counsel to kind of weigh in on this topic as well. I think they have other experience with this topic with some other boards that may be helpful for our board's consideration.
And I'll make a couple comments. This is Lainey, and then I know Jane has significant experience with these in her role. It's not just, it made me kind of chuckle when Rick said, getting rid of serious, because what's serious to one person is not necessarily serious to another. And, that's the issue when you get into this good moral character and, what constitutes integrity, honesty, fairness, all these things. It's all subjective. And so when you start denying licenses or limiting licenses based on the board's conclusion that somebody, has some sort of issue with integrity, honesty, fairness, any one of these things, it's subjective. So it's easier to dispute or argue or challenge than something like your degree came from an accredited university or you've worked this many years in the profession. So those things are solid. And not, you obviously, you need something like this in your statutes and your regulation. And it's just how best to do that to make it as firm as possible. And frankly, I don't know, you define it and you list, these 12 qualities, and as subjective as they can be, I don't know necessarily that there's a better way to do it. You see like moral turpitude and just good moral character. So I think this may be as good as it gets, and I'll certainly let Jane chime in here. The issue becomes is that when you start making decisions and you're basing a denial or limitation on one of these things, that those orders are very specific in linking up the issues to the certain quality, and just making those links as solid as possible. But I'll give it to Jane now.
So the one thing is, I'll have a couple things I was going to discuss when they told me that this would be a topic. I do attend annually the Federation Association of Regulatory Boards, or FARB for short. I think I've brought that up before. The Board of Technical Professions always pays for me to attend, and it's something, it's a national meeting, and it's all regulatory boards. I mean, some states even regulate like plumbers and massage therapists. So there's a lot of things that we don't oversee, but it's just something we all collectively get together. It's for attorneys. And the next one is actually on Friday. We have our annual one starts Friday, but it's all of the attorneys that do like what Lainey and I do from the United States, and we all get together. And one of the topics that they discuss is, how do you get to this, the warrant public trust, which actually is preferable over some statutes we do have in Kansas will say like moral turpitude. And even as an attorney, ours is moral turpitude. But if you were to ask what we would call our disciplinary administrator, which would be the executive director for attorneys, you say, well, what's moral turpitude? They always say, well, you would know it when you see it. So it's not even anything that attorneys can define for us and our license. Like the veterinary board uses moral turpitude, and other boards use what they call good moral character. And good moral character on the national, we have this discussion about every year about good moral character. That seems to be even a more arbitrary term, because what's good moral character? So if you were to try to define the good moral character, now you start running into trouble, because what's my morals as compared to the next person's morals? So if you have an applicant who happens to have a subscription to a pornography magazine, is that some people might think that that's amoralistic, but some people might think, well, it's just pornography, you know? So that's where you start getting into whose morals are you trying to incorporate into that decision? Because like right now, a hot button topic that is every state is discussing is abortions because of what happened with Texas. So is my morals going to be more that I'm imputing my moralistic thoughts on this applicant or this licensee? Or should you have something that's maybe a little bit more grounded? So nationally, they do look to the warrant public trust as more of the, as something that's a little bit, while it looks to be subjective, it can be a little bit more grounded. One of boards that I have, or actually a couple boards that I have, we have a high volume of felony applicants, and that's the cosmetology board and the barbering board. So we get a lot of, and these felons, you know, they are somebody that's trying to make something, you know, a betterment in their life. What we have done in our boards is we call it the felony packet, as a lack of a better term. But this is something that has been discussed in the national level. And so this is something that we've incorporated into some of our high volume felonies boards. The individual has to fill out a packet. I mean, they get the court papers, so they have to get like the journal entry, they have to get the charging document so that the board can look at what were the underlying facts, what was eventually, what did they eventually plead to or found guilty of. But this also requires that the individual has to provide a statement as to what was the felony, give their side of the story. What have they done since that time? And why do they want to be licensed? So these people can, these applicants can provide to the board a statement of, yeah, I was wrong. You know, this is what I've done. I've taken parenting classes. I'm in a batterers intervention program now. I'm in I went to treatment and now I'm active member in AA, so much that I'm even sponsoring individuals. It gives them kind of two, you know, if you give us some letters of reference. And so these people are coming in with letters from, you know, their AA sponsors, their pastors, where they work, their employers. So it gives them something a little bit more, the board something more tangible. So when the board, because that was the issue with the boards is, so you have a felon who's wants to be a productive member of society. They're trying to turn their life around, but how do you know if you're making the right decision? So our boards have asked them to provide these kind of documents. What this does is then the board can make an informed decision. Do they grant this license? So you have somebody who, yes, had a felony, but they have did A, B, C. They have really strong reference letters. So the board has something that they can show to say, yes, they are demonstrating to us they want to be a productive member of society. They have taken this many steps. They are providing what we feel is sufficient enough that they do warrant public trust. So in the event that this person, because we're giving license to barbers who are presently incarcerated for murder, but we will give them a license. They are, in case if anybody didn't realize, Fort Leavenworth has the premier barbering school in the country for federal penitentiaries. But if they've provided all these documents, they look like they could warrant public trust. But then if somebody were to then, inadvertently slit somebody's throat while they were shaving them, and so then there's an outcry as to why did this individual get a license? The board has these tangible documents to say, this is how this individual demonstrated to the board that they warranted public trust. So that is something that the board, while it is a very subjective, the information did provide to the board's confidence that they are making a more objective decision in deciding to give that individual a license or not. So actually warrant public trust is a more consistent term with the federally or nationally, and that is what they are trying to, because there is not really a yardstick. When you have somebody that comes in with what you can look at as thinking that it's a questionable background or conduct from the past, how can is that conduct going to continue on in their professional practice, or have they turned the corner and are making more appropriate decisions? So warrant public trust is actually nationally something that they would prefer, because your other choices are basically moral turpitude, which an attorney can't even define, or good moral character, where it becomes even a more subjective situation. So that's just, I wanted to bring that up or throw that out there for discussion.
Well, I have a question. Instead of using the word moral, a common word that's shared with all professions would be ethical behavior. And that's in all of our code of ethics. And so we could link that back to the code of ethics and all the descriptions of each profession. I think that word moral is really a hard word to define, but ethical behavior is defined in all of our code of ethics, the do's and the don'ts. And I do like the meriting public trust. I think that's by being, ethical, being ethical in our practice.
So I'm looking at and this language is sprinkled throughout your statutes and regulations, but in the example that David provided, so the statute uses the phrase merits public trust, and then the regulation goes in to define merits public trust. And then you get the good moral character language, which is Jane was describing is sometimes an issue. But then you list these 12 characteristics or qualities that are to be considered. I'm just trying. So the suggestion is possess a high standard of good ethical character and fitness.
And I don't even know if the word good needs to be there, but just ethical, professionalism.
High standard of ethical character and fitness.
Something like that. I mean, because it's all defined in each of our code of ethics, the do's and the don'ts and shoulds and the haves.
But the issue with that is it doesn't necessarily have to do with practice. This could be an underlying issue that doesn't have to do with practice.
That's what I was going to say. When we're doing people who have had a criminal background, the ethical practice doesn't come into play yet.
Jane used the example of a felony. And although there's a separate statute that has to do with a felony, again, this often has to do with a background unrelated to I'm sorry if this is the wrong term, but it's kind of a catch-all that has to do with someone's background. that brings to a concern about whether this certain should be licensed.
And I'm sorry, I was just going to make one comment. I am attending the FAR conference at the end of this week with Jane. So as she pointed out, this will be the first law forum that I'll attend. So it'll be interesting to hear discussions on it, and we can certainly cycle back around. But I'm sorry, I interrupted somebody with speaking.
This is Rick, and you really didn't. I'm wondering if the issue in KAR,
Psychology.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. It was just Bruce.
Oh, okay.
He's on mute now.
If the issue in KAR 102.7.1 and similar regulations is the use of the term good moral character, I wonder if that part could just be deleted. Merits of public trust means that an applicant demonstrates, and then there's a list of 12 things that I think are consistent with most of our ethical guidelines, right? And so then it's present focused. So that way the felon who has remediated themselves can still get licensed if they currently demonstrate those things, right? 1 through 12. If we just eliminated if the applicant or licensee demonstrates the following. And it could even be demonstrates, as evidenced by, right? Some test that would allow us to more objectively say, okay, well, did they get letters that demonstrate this? Did they provide a personal statement that demonstrates these things? Just an idea, trying to get around try to avoid the good moral character without introducing more dilemmas.
In my world, I do pre-employment evaluations on law enforcement officers. It's similar. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar. And a lot of these same things come up in those applications. They're concerned about all of them, but they try to operationalize a lot of this stuff because cops are a pretty litigious group and you have to have your ducks in a row. So like for integrity, honesty, credibility and all this, they give them a lie detector test. I'm not sure we want to go that far, but that's really operationalizing the issue of integrity, because you want your cops to have integrity, respect for the laws of the nation. They do a criminal background check that's pretty detailed and not limited just to Kansas. So I think these issues are widespread, and I think we're all kind of concerned about them. But maybe if there's some way to operationalize what we mean by integrity, it would help quite a bit.
Well, and I deal with the flip side of law enforcement. I serve as general counsel for CPOST. And so I see these issues come up at hearing upon the revocation or suspension of the law enforcement certification. And it gets back to what I mentioned at the beginning. It's like you have to take these specific events or things, qualities, and link them to, what integrity, honesty, fairness. And so it's just making that link as solid as possible to defend those decisions.
One thing I do, and I get a lot of questions for, but there's a really good reason why you do that, is in their interviews with the law enforcement agency, they're asked a whole bunch of background questions. What have you done? Did you get caught? Blah, blah, blah. Then I ask them the same questions verbally. Then I ask them the same questions in a written format. And I said, well, why do you keep asking the same questions? Well, a certain amount of the applicants have a wide variety of responses to those. And that really speaks to, the integrity and the credibility, reliability of them. So that's, it's not a real high fancy operational way to go about it, but in some cases it's very, very effective.
I'm in support of cleaning the language up a little bit. I have probably a little more hesitancy to get too specific in terms, and I understand exactly what you're saying, Bruce, but when I'm thinking about and reflecting on the applicants that we receive and trying to, we rely heavily on the supervisory attestations. And this would give a little more understanding of what we're looking for in the things that we go back and ask sometimes on applicants. But, we've done some things where we try to be more specific, and sometimes that can backfire on us a year from now, 5 years from now, something like that. And so, I just appreciate maybe cleaning up the public trust, because we know that's our charge of in our role as board members.
And then we're always stuck in the problem of using past behavior to predict future behavior, which is a pretty risky thing to get involved in. I know in COC, I ask a lot of questions, especially like on substance abuse. Someone says, well, 15 years ago, I got, a patch of 3 DUIs back to back, and I went to treatment, and I'm good to go now. And we don't have any secondary support for that. We don't have, treatment records. We just kind of have to assume that they're being thoroughly, transparent and honest with us. And I hope that's always true, but I suspect there's cases where it's not.
Well, I think what Jane was referring to also, with the felony packet, I don't think I want to go that far necessarily, but I do agree, like with what Bruce is saying, maybe there's some additional information that the applicant can add that will help us make our decision. And I've seen a little bit of that over the years, that they've added some additional information to say, yes, I have been rehabilitated, and this is what I'm doing currently, to continue in my recovery or whatever it would be. So I don't know if there's a way to add that in any area, but that's something that is helpful, at least when I'm helping, to make a decision for the applicant.
And those, Leslie, are triggered by these attestations we're getting in, because when we have something that's vague, we request, and this gives us, I think, what we need to substantiate the request.
Mm-hmm.
But we've had off and on conversations about these attestations and how we use them and how we ask the questions. And I still go back to that's ultimately what we need to be able to do, is ask the questions and require a response to evaluate.
And then there's that lawyer term that makes everyone shake in their boots with due diligence. Have you asked enough questions? Have you asked the right questions? And Jane's smiling because that's a topic of discussion at a lot of hiring meetings.
Well, I was actually just looking, I'm pulling up, I don't know why it's taken so long. I wanted to see what your FAQs had, because that could be something for the board to consider, maybe something on there as to direct the applicant as to what submissions might be, not to say you have to submit this, but if they say, well, what would help help in my situation, if maybe an FAQ to say, kind of walk them through, kind of similar to what we do with our high volume boards, just to say, because we do give them a list of what might be beneficial, but just a thought.
I think for me, I agree with Mary about the flexibility of the current definition, and maybe, like Rick said, take out the good moral character if that's a sticking point. But on the CRC, with the discussion we're having, I think, like you said, an FAQ or something specific on the application they fill out that tells them to give us more information, because I feel like we go back a lot saying we can't make the decision whether they merit the public trust because they didn't tell us how they've rehabilitated or what they've done. So I don't know if it's really changing the definition. I think that gives us the flexibility we need, but it's like you said, FAQ I hadn't thought about, but application or something specific there that first off, they can tell us what we want to know about if they merit the public trust.
On
This
the
is-
applications, when they answer yes to any of the questions, have you had disciplinary action, a felony, what have you. We asked for a detailed description of what happened, and usually they give us a paragraph at most, maybe a few sentences. And I never know, do you want to see that? Because really that's all they gave you. To me, that's not okay. They should have provided more to begin with, but I can ask for more. I could also update the applications to ask, specifically, what have you done since then? Kind of like the conviction packet, only for the other items that are negative.
I was going to add that Laney and I have been involved in some C-post cases, and that's different than just granting a license or hiring someone as someone who has some kind of a documented problem. And you really need a lot more proof that they went to treatment. They say, oh yeah, I went to therapy and I'm good to go. Well, we'd like to see a therapist report on that.
And that may be not solve this problem, because I don't know if it's necessarily a problem, but just having that information, more information to rely on. And so maybe the solution is just, beefing up those applications and solidifying what kind of documentation the board wants to see when different type of issues arise. Do you want to see a certificate of completion of treatment, like a closure of probation, termination, journal entries, because I don't know that stuff is specifically required. And so people just go in and they fill out the application and they think, oh, well, I filled out all the boxes. And there's probably some additional information that the board wants to see. And so they don't necessarily know that to provide it. So that may offer some help as well.
So the burden is on the licensee to provide us with that information. And you're right, if we ask for it and they don't provide it, then we can only do what we can do as a board. So I think that's part of it too. We're asking for the information. If it's not there, then we have to make the decision with the information that we have. I think that's what Leslie Allen was talking about as well. If it's just a paragraph, then if that's all the licensee wants to provide to us in the effort to get approved, then we have to make a decision based on that.
So thinking back to the last couple of years, it seems like the reason this is on the agenda today is that, and that you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, is with applicants coming out of school and somebody, maybe their practicum supervisor, has said, no, I don't recommend licensure based upon something they witnessed. Maybe they were late, maybe they didn't do their documentation, maybe they didn't get along with that supervisor. And so there was these conflicts. Maybe the person didn't want to take a look at themselves. And the board has felt like we should deny the license based upon that feedback. And then we would receive feedback from the Attorney General that said, well, I don't know if that really fits this merits the public trust. So I guess I'm looking for clarity that is actually the problem we're trying to solve here is, do we have enough in language? Are we asking the right questions from the references to fit our language so that we can say for some degree of certainty when we have that gut in the, fire in the belly that says, we really shouldn't. They stuck their neck out. They said, I don't recommend. Can we then support that by what we've already put in place?
So I think that goes back. So you're looking at this statement of a supervisor or somebody, and they're saying this, this, and this. And it's just being able to take those comments or those concerns and link them to one of these 12 qualities and make it firm. And you can, it's all about taking those facts and linking them to one of these qualities and how strong that link is to one of those qualities.
Well, I'm going to sound like a broken record again, but Deb, thank you for bringing that up because I had written that down as a particular question because I remember lots of comments from Janet, right, about, well, it's just, I don't know how you're linking that letter to, if the regulation read merits the public trust as evidenced by the following, or as evidenced by letters of recommendation or supervisor comments, statements regarding, I mean, listing out in the regulation the things that we would use to determine those 12 items. Would that help the applicant
And
do a better
Leslie
job?
Allen, you know best here, but I mean, isn't there there's different regulations or requirements to provide that supervisory reference, right?
Well, there's two different things. There's the supervisory, there's the practicum supervisor for professions except doctoral, and then supervisor attestations, and then just professional references. But one of the problems that occurs is that sometimes the supervisor, like the practicum supervisor, will list concerns and negative comments, but then say they recommend them for licensure. So perhaps somehow changing the forms to make it not so easy to do that.
Yeah.
Say one or the other, not both.
And the complication factor was that if it's the practicum supervisor and then they passed the practicum class, we were told, well, you really can't, they really shouldn't have passed them then. And that's partially the school's responsibility, but again, we can't not know information when we get it, regardless of what some other entity decided to do.
Okay, I'm the newbie here, but can we not ask for further information after they submitted their application?
We do.
Yes, we do and can.
Yeah. We have, yeah.
Yeah, the question that we're sort of debating here is that we have felt like sometimes we've received enough information to not want to license someone or not approve that license, and yet there seems to be not a solid ground in which to do that by what's in our regulations or what reach we actually have to do that.
Okay, thanks.
But in those cases, haven't we, most often than not, we've provided additional actions for that licensee to take to be able to become licensed, or we license them with those requirements. So I think that covers a lot. Sorry, David.
No,
Everyone, it's Lainey. I'm sorry. I have to jump off now, but I leave you in good hands with Jane. I spoke to David about this. So I will download with Jane and David after the meeting, and I will see everybody tomorrow. So
Thank you.
have a good rest of the meeting.
Bye, Lainey.
I was just going to say, that's the problem with trying to, because these are such nuanced issues, and no matter how we write the language, there's always going to be a circumstance that's going to come up that's going to be just a little uncomfortable. But I think the process by which we make a decision based on the information that we have, we ask for more information, we ask to give the applicant an opportunity to explain, provide us additional information. And then even then, if we still think no and we deny, they have the right then to request a hearing and to be able to come before the group and again, make their case. So I think the cleanup's really, really good. It's just complicated and nuanced, and there's probably no way to really get around that other than, as people indicated, I think the FAQ is good to say, here's some information, if you're have one of these situations, it would be really great if you provided this kind of information to the board. I think that would be helpful to applicants.
So are we looking at 10271 and the language of good moral character? Is that off the table here, or are we still discussing that? Because I would support Rick's comment on maybe just eliminating that and either replacing it. I forget how you mentioned that, Rick, in evidence by the following behaviors, or my suggestions of high standards of ethical behaviors, professional ethical behaviors. Those are all defined thoroughly in everybody's code of ethics. And as a matter of fact, they list a lot more than these 12 points, you know, and I don't know, my thoughts only.
Just to be clear, Carolyn, it would be, that's just the sample regulation, but it would be in every profession's regulation.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. To be consistent.
So where do we go from here? Jane or?
Are we looking at more revisions than just removing the moral piece? Like Rick was talking about, as evidenced by. I like that.
I do too.
Is that in the FAQ? Is that what you're saying, Deb?
No, I think it needs to be in the language itself,
Okay.
and then we can further illuminate in the FAQ.
And I sort of like the word ethics in that instead of moral, because we all identify with professional ethics. We all have a code of ethics, and I think every profession would probably agree to, you know. But these are wanting people that you know are solid and you know following the code of ethics.
But the only, I agree with you, Carolyn, but the only issue is that if some of these people have engaged in behaviors prior to them being a professional or a professional trainee, they can't be held to those ethics. My ethics as a psychologist only apply, right? So before I was a psychologist, I'm a private citizen, I can disclose personal information about people. That's highly unethical, but it's not if I'm not a psychologist, right? And so it may suggest poor judgment, but I don't know that you can hold me to that professional ethics standard before I'm a professional. I think that was the concern that I heard. I don't know if someone made that point. So I don't know how to thread that needle exactly. I get where you're going and I agree with you. I just think there's a little sticky point there about, you know, and maybe not, maybe I'm being.
No, I agree with you, Rick, because ethics by their very definition are dilemmas, right? It's the an ethical decision in one context may be different in a different context. So that, I don't know, I think that's moving away from the specificity that we're hoping to get here. I mean, I can, you know, my practicum supervisors say, no, they were not honest in this situation. It's very clear cut. No, they weren't reliable. They didn't come to work. They didn't whatever. So I like the concreteness of these words. And I think perhaps the missing link in my mind has not been to tie this back to the people giving the references. And then if we add the evidenced by, then I think we've kind of closed the loop about what the responsibility is of these people. I mean, I think we can even put in there, you know, as in this attestation, I'm certifying that that the board is going to take my information and use it to uphold this definition.
I agree with you, Deb, on that one. That does make sense. Although in the code of ethics, they really don't speak to ethical dilemmas. They're pretty clear. Don't do this. Don't do. These are standards, and they are clear, you know, and they do reflect a lot of the 12, you know, points. But having said that, I'm perfectly okay with in evidence and just changing the language a little bit and omitting the good moral character.
To further close that gap, I wonder, Leslie mentioned a second ago that we might change the instructions we give to the letter
Yes.
writers. And just, I wonder if there's language that we could help them understand the dilemma that they put, now that we're talking about dilemmas, the dilemma they put us in. And so, you know, so even just a little comment, you know, if you are recommending this person, it suggests that they meet these criteria. If they do not meet these criteria, in your view, do not recommend them, right? I mean, maybe that's too on the nose, and maybe that, I don't know, Jane, maybe you need to rein me in. Maybe that's leading the witness or whatever, but just helping them understand the connection, the letter writer, helping that person understand the connection between what they're putting on the page and what we have to do. I don't know what that language would be. It might be a real pain in the butt, but just a thought.
This is Jane again. I would wonder though, Rick, are we looking, you know, as the board, that seems like something that the professional would want to fill out. If some of these people, you know, like I see in my other boards, they might have a layperson submitting something. As far as maybe they want their pastor to submit something to say that, you know, they have, you know, have knew them when they were this little reprobate. Now the growth I have seen from when this individual was in trouble, and now I see a whole different person, or, you know, whatever their higher power is. But I don't know if the layperson would, I mean, I can see in a professional sense, I would see the professional understanding some of these, but if there was the potential that they wanted to have some lay people submitting things, I don't know if they would quite understand what the board's expectation would be in that sense.
So in the application, we have professional reference forms, but those are just for the professionals. And then perhaps if they wanted to send someone else, they would do a letter. But on our attestations, they say, do you recommend for license with reservation or not at all? But our references just say yes or no. Would it be opening up and making it scary if we put with reservation on the professional reference forms?
How would that help us make a decision? I guess if it's yes or no. You know what
Well,
I'm saying?
because Rick said, you know, if you have issues, then you shouldn't recommend. But sometimes there are people that have issues, but they wouldn't recommend they not license them at all. But they would license them like under supervision, or, you know, with specific things that the person would have to show for a certain amount of time. But it might open it up too much. So
yeah,
I can see circumstances, and we've had students here who, you know, had some issues during their practicum that we wanted people to be aware of, but not to the point that we didn't think that, you know, with further coaching and work and maturation, that they would probably be fine. So, you know, I'm okay with people sending a, you know, yes, I recommend them, but there are kind of these issues. But again, that gets back to the subjective of, you know, how important are those things to them versus how they might be to other people, or whether other people might not have even mentioned those issues. So,
well, and
but
that
I do-
comes down to, sorry.
I do
Go
like
ahead,
the
David.
idea of either recommending or not recommending with reservations, because that really is going to put us into a more difficult position, I think.
Go ahead, Mary.
But are those two separate things then? Because I'm thinking about it as a person who completes many of those forms. I'm sure you do too, David. And it gives the opportunity to give the feedback, which the board wants. that this is someone who does have development yet, and or maybe there's an area like, it doesn't mean they shouldn't be licensed, but I want an opportunity to share with you the observations in one or two areas that may be problematic. Because if I have to say yes or no, unless it's egregious, I'll probably say yes. So the with reservation gives that opportunity to just say that feedback that's necessary, because it would be really strange. And we've seen this on professional forums where someone says yes, but then they write something that's contradictory, and then we're in that zone again. And all we're really trying to do, I think, is get the most information we can to make sure that we are upholding public trust and safety.
But then what do I do with those people who recommend, but they have issues? Do I bring them all to the board? Sometimes they go to the board member if you guys decide that's acceptable to go on. But a lot of people think that when they make a comment to the board's going to do something about it, or I've had people say, well, they should have a supervisor who's going to do this, or a strong supervisor because of this. And that's not really anything we can do unless you do a CAO.
I think that's a good point, Leslie. I mean, Mary, what you were saying is it's helpful information for the board to have, but really what are we doing with it? So we're asking for information. If somebody says, they were late a couple of times, and so I'm going to recommend them, but I have reservations of their timeliness, I just don't know that we're really going to do anything with that information, or we're not passing it along to anyone else. Or if a complaint comes in 3 months, we're not looking back at that original application to see, oh, what were the reservations at the time? I don't know that we need to ask for information that we're not going to do anything with for the most part.
Yeah, I hear that, and I think we have done things with some of that information, short of just denying an application. I think we've all seen, at least on the CRC, or those on the board that we've had these discussions with. It's like, we're trying to license people. We want to get people to the place where they're eligible, but we have done that where we might bring them in under some type of an agreement for extra supervision or additional supervision. I just don't want, I don't want people to feel like they don't provide information because we don't do anything with it, or don't provide information because they're going to license them anyway. I think we're asking because this is our charge. This issue of public safety is our mission. That's what we're here to do. And so if we don't ask the information, what are we doing? Kind of thing.
But I think if we're going to ask it to propose it in a way, or to ask the question in a way that it is leading to the information that we need, not just a very open-ended question, do you have reservations? Because that could get us from something that, we may not be able to do anything about to, wow, this person really made some ethical decisions that may not fit within our specific code. I mean, there's a whole continuum of answers that one could get. So I think by leading that question into, does your reservation fit into one of these categories? If so, please expand further. I don't know.
Do we have access to?
Sorry, Bruce. I'm trying to understand how this is different than what we've been doing, because we do ask the additional questions, right? We might say, well, at this point, we need more information. So Mary, are you just suggesting that we get that more in advance instead of doing it the way we've always done it, where we say, hey, we need more information? If you're going to mention these things in your written information about this applicant, can you provide us with additional information? And the second point, we've done this before, and I think Lainey had said to me, I said, well, let's ask the professional that's providing that reference. And Lainey said we should also ask the applicant. So it's not that we're keeping the applicant in the dark. We're also asking the applicant. And I think that's important too, because we're not all going to have, where all personalities meet and things that you may see differently than, your supervisor or whatever. So I think those are separate things to think about too. How are we doing it different? Why would we change it? So.
Yeah, I'm in support of the just minor language change that was presented here. And also perhaps looking at, this has come back, I think, multiple times on the board, look at our questions on the application to make sure that they are consistent with the information we're wanting to obtain. And I really like this FAQ idea that's come out, and that might be helpful not only for the applicant who's completing the application, but for the person providing the reference.
Do we want to look up other boards and see if they have come up with a way to operationally define some of these concepts we have here? It seems like we're trying to invent the wheel. Maybe someone has already invented the wheel and we can just copy them. Is there such a thing that people know of? Do other boards have they struggled with this same issue and come up with some good solutions?
David, I think that's something for you.
Yeah, I will put this on my list. So.
I have a question. If the application, so I would think the professional references and the application questions themselves need to be looked at. Do you want me to take them to the attorneys first or bring them to the board first?
Well,
Bruce, you brought that up. What are you thinking? Sorry, Deb, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that I'm not, until we've landed on what the regulatory language will be, is it premature to go to the attorneys and ask the questions about the application? I mean, it feels like that needs to be set first.
I thought you guys had, I'm sorry.
Well, I think we're getting close. I think
Okay.
if David can do a review of what some other folks have done. I mean, I don't think we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think we've just identified in the past a couple of tweaks that we need to make to feel more confident in denying applications based upon this area alone. I think that's what I remember us needing to do. So I think we're real close, but it feels like we need to settle on that. And so I'm wondering about just staff taking this, what we've talked about, just kind of like we did on the last one, and then bringing it back to the next meeting for review. And then David could do that homework. And then we could do the application. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so to button it up, we could have Jane or Lainey make those changes where we discuss the merit, the public trust, and the changes that I think Rick was suggesting and some others had agreed to, and then bring back that language to us. And then from there, like Deb said, we could have David check with other boards to see what the applicants, if there's different questions. Does that summarize it for everyone? Any additional questions or comments on that? Is that okay for everyone that we kind of table this and let the attorneys make those changes and end the discussion?
I agree.
Okay. Okay.
I agree.
Thank you. Anyone opposed to moving on? Okay. So continuing education requirements and diversity, equity, inclusion on our agenda. That's the next thing. So I think we had all went to our committees and asked those questions, and we were going to come back with reports. I'm not sure if committees have all been able to meet regarding this. So how would we like to move forward on this one? Anyone have a report from their committee or have a chance to speak to the committee?
Yeah, our committee did meet, discuss that, was not in favor of including that for a few reasons. One, feels like those issues, although very important, are often being currently integrated into a lot of trainings that people have the opportunity to take. They certainly don't want to see it replace diagnostic required trainings. And then, that becomes kind of a slippery slope for all the different groups and communities out there. It's kind of already covered that you shouldn't be serving people that you aren't trained to be able to provide services in an adequate manner to. So that was kind of the feeling from our group.
This is Carolyn, and Andrea, you can speak up, but I think that we did talk at one point to our committee, and it was felt the same way, that it was not that it's not important, but it's under the umbrella of our 3 required ethical requirements, in which you could take specialized courses at any time. CEUs. Andrea, is that what you? And it's been a while back since we've talked.
Yeah, that's been a couple of months back. But I would agree that was the sentiment at the time. I would wonder, since several CEUs have to come under the Bsrb for approval, is there a way that we could look at it through the diversity, equity, and inclusion lens when these approvals come through the board, and to make sure that there are the DEI just it's being looked through that lens, I guess, would be my ask. If we won't require it from licensees, then when they seek different trainings that are Bsrb approved, just ensuring that there would be provided opportunities that would include the DEI component. And as you said, David, there already are several that do, but just if we can make sure to highlight that from the Bsrb perspective, that would be something that we would be looking for. And I don't know how that approval process happens or doesn't happen.
Well, would you then be looking at that being a requirement then? Because then we would have to look for it. Is that what you're asking, Andrea?
I'm just saying that as the approvals come through to the Bsrb of the trainings, that there is offerings that include the DEI component. And again, there are many that already do, but I'm just wondering if we can look at it through that lens as well. And I don't know who approves those trainings or what that looks like. So I'm also speaking kind of without knowing the full circle of how that happens.
If you're referring to pre-approved trainings, when they submit their information, they tell us what they're going to offer.
Absolutely.
We don't tell them what they need to offer.
Right.
Because they can apply for an approval for any number of things. Certificates of attendance won't necessarily tell us that that's being done. I mean, we only audit 10% of the licensees. We could look for it, but I don't think we could, unless it's in a requirement. I don't see how we could tell them they needed to do it.
Right, and I agree. I think that each CEU is quite different in topics, and you'd almost have to redefine the ethical requirement to include, this, because I don't believe that anyone would know that. And you're right, they just send them in individually on specific topics. Some that address inclusion. So I don't know how we'd go about requiring that or being able to look for that in those CEU submissions programs.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, you don't do that for every profession anyway.
Right.
No.
So
that's correct, Deb. Only social work.
Psychology was very strongly in favor of including this. And in fact, KPA had put forward a proposal that they wanted us to consider for this. And our advisory board was all on board.
Would that be an additional 3 hours?
Yes.
In addition to the 3-hour ethics?
So we have 6 hours that are required for diagnostic or treatment, 3 hours that are required for ethics. The advisory committee was okay with the possibility that a course could cover both ethics and diversity in the same 3 hours, right? So it's not necessarily another 3 hours out of the total required. So and I gave the example, we had a speaker here not long ago who did a talk on ethical treatment of diverse clients in a particular setting. And that would have met in the view of the advisory board, that would have met the spirit of what they were requiring, or we're asking for, not requiring.
I like that, Rick, because I hadn't really thought about that. And my advisory committee did not entertain some sort of language that would suggest that that topic has to be covered in some way in what you receive, not that it had to be just, separate and distinct.
Right. So I think that for many of us, it would be possible to encourage or require, some DEI language in what we already require. So I know, if other boards are like psychology, other professions are like psychology, within the X number that you have already required, there needs to be diversity represented. And so that would, and I think the intent, right? The intent at least with the KPA, I think the intent was to grow our competencies in more diverse clients, recognizing that, yeah, there's lots of offerings out there, but that doesn't mean people, it's not a field of dreams, right? You build it, they will come. Just because it's something is offered doesn't mean people will do it. And our advisory committee felt that the board has an obligation to encourage the professions to become more inclusive and more competent in this regard. That's speaking for them anyway.
Yeah, the MFT advisory met on this, and we did actually discuss that it would be able to be covered across other types of requirements, such as something that was diagnosis and treatment of X population or an ethical consideration of X population. Where our advisory committee sort of struggled a bit is that, and it echoes the comments earlier about competency in the people that you're treating. And so, there was discussion of, well, if I'm a rural provider, my diverse population might be farmers. And that may not be the intent, I think, of this 3-hour requirement. And so if we're trying to just ensure cultural competency and that you are getting continuing education among the populations we serve, or is this intent about racial inequity, gender inequity, and I just want to make sure that we don't put something in statute that, again, 5 years from now, there's something else we need to put on that list. Does that make sense?
One of the things I was thinking when we were talking was that we were just asked not long ago about including a mandatory suicide training, and we decided not to.
Laura, did you want to provide information from your committee?
Yes, thank you. Very similar to what Rick was speaking about. The advisory committee discussed not wanting to make mandatory hours for DEI, but to include it in certain, along with diagnostics, ethics, some of the other CEUs that are already required.
So in requiring or suggesting, what does that mean for Leslie or whomever at the board that does the reviewing of the CEUs?
Or for that matter, notifying those providers who, give workshops and submit. I mean, they would have no idea.
The issue before us right now, correct, is the statutory requirement that we're doing 3 hours. And so I think that's the issue, at least right now, we need to resolve. And then if there's some other lenses we want to incorporate, that's a practice issue, right? Correct?
Yeah, I was just going to.
And I appreciate you, keeping me on track there. But yeah, I think we encompassed the whole thing, and that's what I was trying to kind of get at. But go ahead, David. Sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to weigh in. So yeah, if there is a change recommended by the board in terms of requiring hours in a certain thing like diversity, equity, and inclusion, that would be something that would require a statutory change. So it would be something that would go into a bill. So it would be something before the 2022 legislature. And then there would be some changes that would be needed in regulation to make that coincide. Now, if there is a change in, see right now in terms of there is the conversation by certain members of the board in terms of would it be okay to allow these hours in both ethics and have the same hours count in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So currently right now, it's the practice of behavioral sciences regulatory board that we look at the hours uniquely. So we don't allow something to count in two categories. For example, if something were to qualify in ethics, but it also
Beth, can you bring me some tissue?
if something were to qualify in ethics and also diversity, in diagnosis and treatment, we would look for first and say the hours would go into the ethics category, and then we would look elsewhere in the hours to satisfy the other requirements. So if you wanted to allow something to count for both categories, that's something that you guys could decide, but it would be something that would be a change. So we would just ask for clarity in terms of if you'd like us to make that. But yeah, if there is something that you would like to require in terms of these hours, that is something that would require a statutory change. So it would go into a bill.
So I have a question from Rick or somebody else. Are you saying that it could say, the statute could say ethics or diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I don't believe that's what my advisory committee was asking for.
I
think-
think
I
it wouldn't
guess I'm
be
not
or, it would be and. So it might be an ethical topic that would include a DEI focus is what I heard, but I could be wrong.
So, right, I think what my committee was hoping to see is a language saying within the 9 specified required hours above, 3 must
Okay.
include attention to diversity issues broadly construed.
Okay, thank you. That makes more sense.
The Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee, they kind of had a similar discussion where it's important. Do we want to require discrete, additional hours? We finally just left it that they were comfortable if the will of the board was to proceed in some way with adding it, that we would get on board with that. So I like the direction this is going.
So do we want to make this change, or is anyone opposed to adding that, kind of what Rick and Leslie were suggesting?
I'm opposed to statutory language to require it.
Me too.
Okay.
So then it would be by each profession by itself, wouldn't it, Dave? I mean, it doesn't have to be all the professions.
I think in the past, sometimes there have been things that were just for one profession or the other. It's kind of up for the board to decide if they'd like this to be uniform or if they'd like it to split.
It sounds like the board does not believe that it should be uniform. Am I incorrect?
Well, that's
in
not
that,
what
or-
I would say. I would
Okay.
say that I would hope that we could make a uniform decision. But I don't want to, I'm not in favor of a statutory change.
I agree.
I agree too.
I agree as well.
I disagree.
I think another option we have is to take it back to our advisory committees with the specific discussions that we've had today, get another feel. But presently, I would disagree with statutory changes, but there's none of this wasn't talked about in the advisory committees at all.
Right, I like that opportunity. I know that does extend it out a little bit, but I would also just be curious to understand a little bit more about the opposition to changing it in statutory language.
Our opposition is just of the 40 hours, then we would be requiring 6 and 3 and 3 more, you know, so I would say that we did discuss the types of overlap, that if it could be used for ethics or diagnosis, and I think that change would need to be made. But once we start prescribing more than half of what people are required to do, you know, again, going back to, this is an extremely important topic, and it is about your competency in your own profession. And so are we requiring, what I believe the intent of this is around racial inequity and around gender inequity right now, but is that what this is? Is this about rural cultural competence and inclusion? And that's where we just then filter out what I believe the intent of requiring this is. So I'm not opposed to us being competent and receiving training in diversity, equity, inclusion. We're opposed to the statutory change to make it happen when I don't think it will uphold the intent of what this is about. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Yeah.
Is there not a way to include those other groups? I mean, I think your concern is that diversity here means only two things. And it doesn't have to mean only two things, right?
I think for us,
It's everything.
we're, for example, we're doing a special project to do outreach to 3 particular groups: veterans, people involved in the agriculture industry, and a growing Hispanic population. And so we are dedicating certain staff to each of those. But we're not going to try to train everybody to do all of that, because then the number of hours you're asking people to get really good training so that they are competent to do that work. And that's kind of my concern, is you could easily just keep finding subpopulations that do require kind of specific knowledge to do your best work with. And so that's kind of, again, I think echoing what Mary has said, our opposition to rewriting the statutes specifically to include that.
Yeah, and my take is under diversity, I view that as a social worker under our ethical training and code of ethics, that has included everything. Everything is included. And I do like the idea of CEUs being focused on specific subtopics or areas of diversity, including inclusion. You know, I think that I agree with all of that. I do believe that's in our core foundation under diversity, including of all, treating all people with dignity and respect.
Well, I think this goes a little further than that. And I can tell you that up until this year, I haven't received any training. I shouldn't say any. I've not really received a whole lot of training in this area. I don't remember a lot of options. So, I mean, I think that will change. But clearly we have an interesting decision to make.
So the definition of what that means can be put in the CEU regulation as well. The
Leslie, could you
definition of what
repeat
that
that?
training can include.
Leslie, could you repeat that? I didn't quite hear.
The definition of what the training may or should include or may include could be defined in the CEU regulation so that it's not so narrowly defined.
So then I would just, as that, to follow up on that point, then why would we change our statutory requirement? If our intent is not to be sensitive to the gaps in the training that maybe has been out there. Right now, I would say you could find a DEI training anywhere, which is amazing. But why would we require it if we have to define it? And then when that definition changes, because that definition will change over time, it's really everything, right? And so that's where I'm saying I don't think the intent of this proposal coming up was everything. Because quite honestly, I could probably say if you do any special population training at all, it would fall under this requirement or should fall under this requirement. So I'm not sure why we would want to regulate that.
Maybe to ensure that people are thinking about those special populations. So rural, so I don't treat rural people. I have had no training in rural people. And like to Deb's point, maybe that's because there's no training available for that.
So would that mean that we need to add rural?
Not add it, but include it. Right? So I just don't understand why, I guess I just don't see this as particularly restrictive.
I will just chime in a little bit here. I am not, of course, a professional member, so my experience is in a different field. But in the work that I'm doing, DEI is a focus that we have. It is very inclusive, given the title. I guess that's a good thing, right? But it is a very broad definition. It is a lens, as Andrea was mentioning, it is a lens through which we are looking at all of the decisions that we're making in our organization. And so I'm hearing, what I'm hearing is everybody has a lot of good intentions about this. I don't think the argument is that people don't think it's a good idea. I think we all think it is a good idea. I think we seem to be a little struggling maybe with how to define it. And so I don't have an answer to that, but I just would like to say that I just think if we can look at it from a broader perspective, I don't necessarily think we should change the statute language either, because I think that could be too limiting for something to me that is broader and should just be applied to other aspects of things that we're doing. So I don't have the specific answer on how to make it work with this as far as the CEUs and such, but I kind of liked what Leslie had to offer, Leslie Allen, about just adding it as an option. So maybe that could, in the definitions of CEUs, so people know that that's a topic that is of importance to us and that we would like to see people have that more education in it. But it could be very broad. It could be rural issues. It could be racial. It could be gender. It could be, my gosh, there's just so much to look through, disability as well. So that's what I'm just offering, is that I think it's obviously maybe shows that maybe our board might need to do a little bit of work on some DEI education. That's what my board that I'm on, my other world, is doing as well, because we're educating ourselves. We're realizing how little we know about it as well. So just offering that, I think it's good that we're having the discussion, but I don't want us to get too limited by defining it so tightly. And that is my concern in this.
I support what Jacqueline has mentioned and what Leslie has suggested.
Well, to be the bearer of bad news, the CEU regulation simply talks about how you can obtain your CEUs, but it does have ethics and diagnosis and treatment defined there. And you can't not to be disrespectful, but you can't really recommend.
Okay.
That doesn't mean anything regulatory board wise. It would have to be a requirement or not in the regulations and statutes. And you couldn't put it in the regulation unless it's in the statute. I don't think.
So Leslie, what you were suggesting, we could define it in the CEU regs, and now you're saying that's not something we can
No,
do?
I went, like Mary was saying, that it should be broad, that it should include more than, you know, a very straight definition, that it should be broad. That's why I said that. That if it was a requirement, you could define it in the regulations.
So I guess I'm trying to figure out how to proceed here. Are we needing more time? Do we want to take a vote?
I'm wondering, like Carolyn suggested, since this is something that this particular way of looking at it may or may not have been presented to all committees, if there's an opportunity to present the updated language and then come back to make a decision. I know that that extends it out, and we'd like to have some sort of resolution to it. But also, I think Jacqueline brings up a good point that, I mean, with all of us having varying definitions or concerns, I think just to assume that because we are in the professions that we are, that people are seeking trainings or opportunities, I don't think that that's in the best interest of the public either. So I think finding some sort of balance.
Okay, so is everyone okay with taking it back to your committees and with the additional language and getting some additional information?
If it goes back to the committees, I would just request if the committees provide the information if they would want it to replace ethics.
I don't think replace was it. I think it was and or be included in ethics. So what we're taking back is that diversity, equity, inclusion is anything that you deem, because that's what I'm hearing. And I think, again, I am completely supportive of competent training. So I don't want that to be lost. But if we include it to everything, why are we including it? And that's really resonated with me, because our ethics, I think all of our ethics probably have something about competent care.
I think, Mary, that's a good point. But just as Deb and others have suggested, that there's not that many trainings out there. So I think it's kind of a trickle down effect. If the board then requires that this lens be looked at for our licensees, then I think we will see that more opportunities will then be provided for our licensees in these areas. And you're right, it can be inclusive of many, many different things, disabilities, gender. I mean, it is pretty open. So that's just one thought to put out there.
But I think to say that it is everything is a little bit of an overstatement.
Well, it might be, but I
yeah, and I think you're
saying,
doing,
Rick. But I think that's where this definition problem comes up, because my thought, and no one has really said that in this, my understanding of why this came forward was clearly based on what's happening in the world, particularly in the United States, around all these racial inequities and other special groups that have sort of risen to the surface. If that's not the intent, someone please correct me.
well, let me correct you then, because this has been an issue in APA for much longer than 2020. Okay, we've actually been dealing with this in APA and requiring diversity training in our programs for several years. What has not been happening is an equivalent requirement in continuing education. So for 15 or 20 years, APA programs have required diversity training in our training programs, right? That's been a thing. It goes well before Black Lives Matter. It goes well before any murders from last year. What has not followed suit is required continuing education, so that we are requiring our providers to stay informed of how all people are different, right? And your example of rural, the idea that all the rural people in Kansas are identical is ridiculous, right?
Agreed, 100%. Right. Yeah.
And so saying that I'm focusing on rural Kansans, okay, well, what about the diversity in those rural farmers out in Kansas? Is there not diversity there?
Yeah,
have,
and
we have
please
gay
understand, I'm not
farmers.
disagreeing with you on the definition. When we are a regulatory board, these are the things that are going to come up because most people could make the case that their specific population is something they need continuing ed on. So again, I'm not arguing, please understand, I do DEI training in my agency. There's nothing against diversity and equity and inclusion that I don't support fully. When we put it into statutory change, I want to understand what we're trying to achieve. And if it's cultural competence, cultural humility, whatever the case may be among our licensees, then that's the message that I want to take back.
And again, just I'm under the umbrella of diversity, inclusion, because under diversity, it includes all people uniquely, whether it's gender, whether it's sex, racial, everything. It includes everything. And I believe that, we continue just to need to be, trained. But I getting back and just maybe summarizing this, I think maybe I recommend that we take it back to the advisory committees, maybe for one more look. But I'd also like to have some sort of idea of how that, maybe Dave or some sort of idea of how that statutory language would look like or would include, because I think that's important to present as well. I wouldn't.
Okay. So maybe for the committees, David and Leslie can give some additional information on that. So, so we'll take it back. Sorry, Carolyn. We'll take it back to the committees then. We'll move on then.
Okay,
Just so I'm clear, the statutory change would be the 3-hour requirement. It would be in the regulation where that would be defined, correct?
if you want to define it, you don't have to. I thought you were saying it needed to be broad. So it was my error when I said it could be defined. You don't have to define it.
So Leslie C. Wester, if I'm understanding correctly, we'll get language from David and Leslie Allen on what to present back to our committees.
From this meeting today, I think, just to clarify, I think each committee probably advisory committee needs to have some additional information when they take it back to their committee. Okay, David, thumbs up. Okay. Okay. All right. So moving on, records of deceased practitioners. Another thing you had taken back to your committees. And I think we've been talking about this for quite some time. So hopefully we can get something decided today. David, do you have anything to add as far as?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to clarify that there's two different elements here, and one is records from. We've been frequently talking about it as records of deceased practitioners. There is also a similar aspect, and that has to do with records that are abandoned. So that may not necessarily be someone who has been deceased, but basically the idea is that these records don't have a logical custodian. And the question is, who should take the records, and then who should serve as the custodian of the records? I did have a conversation with Jane about this topic because at some of the advisory committee meetings, they've been talking about some of the practical ways that this could occur. And so I know that there is a statute under the Board of Healing Arts. I've taken a little bit of a look at the statute for the Board of Healing Arts. In terms of some of the discussions of the advisory committees, I'll let individuals from the board go ahead and talk about sort of what their committees have discussed, but I wanted to make you aware that I did have a brief conversation with Jane about this, and she was going to be sitting in for Lainey. And so she might have some other comments to add on this topic as well.
So the Counseling Advisory Committee stated their desire to have a question on the application stating, or a statement, a box they could check that says, I have a plan for the dispensation of records should I become incapacitated, and then the name and contact information of the person those records would go to. So it establishes some accountability up front, that they've thought about it, that they have a plan for what would happen to their records.
Did anyone have anything different than that? Because I'm hearing that's kind of been the common denominator in this. Anything different, Deb?
No, well, not really different, but I think also kind of being mindful of the cart before the horse. The second we require that, then that's going to raise a lot of questions and have, are we prepared? I realize that's not totally on us, but what resources exist out there to direct people? Because, and I mean, I think there needs to be some lead in time because we're talking about doing this maybe a renewal. So then I'm caught off guard. Oh, well, gosh, what do I need to do? I can't even check this box kind of thing. So I just think implementation wise, we just need to think through some of that and to think about where can we direct people and how can we do some sort of educating going into that requirement.
I agree.
Yeah, the maintenance of the information became a topic in that conversation as we talked about this particular item. Does the BSRB have the capacity to track that information? How do we actually inform clients that if something happens, this is the responsible party? So as Deb was saying, sort of the next questions that all fall in line if we require this.
I think in the case of abandoned records, our advisory committee, KDADS takes, responsibility of closed facilities. Seems like BSRB would have a similar responsibility.
So, and Jane, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe in certain cases, if records are abandoned, there's a division of the Attorney General's office, maybe Consumer Protection, that can temporarily seize records. I'm not sure if they act as custodian of the records in terms of receiving requests or anything like that, but I thought temporarily they would have the ability to seize them, but let me know if I'm incorrect on that.
Yes, there is. When I was with the Board of Healing Arts, I know you guys get tired of hearing that, but I learned so much from there. I was there 5 years. And I just want a little caveat. I want you to know David did not invite me to today's meeting. I had to call and cry on the phone the other day. So that's why you guys are stuck having to listen to me. But otherwise, David tried to protect you from me. So
my mistake.
There is the Consumer Protection Act. And in fact, I was trying to find it this morning. I did not realize, I was told it was a very large, voluminous statute, and it's many, many moving parts. When you talk about the patient identification information, that's what actually, you might all be familiar with, like the Attorney General's office. I think it's in March. They will take all the personal documents. They set it up all over the state of Kansas, so they will come get all your personal identifying information and dispose of it, because that is in the Consumer Protection Act, that documents that contain confidential information are protected. So with the Attorney General's office, which I did learn when I was at the Healing Arts, is that if a physician were to have abandoned documents, the Attorney General's office under the Consumer Protection Act would actually want to protect those documents because that is confidential health information. And so it would be the same for your records because they do contain confidential information. So if they are abandoned, it's not the Attorney General's office is going to, you can use them as your backup contingency plan. This is for somebody, the solo practitioner who had no practicing partner, was not affiliated with an agency. And so that all these documents, the family all of a sudden doesn't know what to do with these documents because the practitioner passed away unexpectedly. The Attorney General's office under the Consumer Protection Act will assist with securing those confidential files. And then what I understand they have done in other situations, like when I was at the Healing Arts, clear out in the panhandle of Kansas. So you have the sole practitioner in like Moscow. I understand that's the way southwest corner. What they would do in this situation is if that individual had passed away, the family's contacting them, they will assist with trying to locate another practitioner in that vicinity to assist with, and that the other practitioner has to meet certain assurances that the information will continue to remain confidential, but they do assist with trying to protect that, ensuring that patients, because those are patient records, ensuring that they get them to the correct patient also, because then the patient can take the records, or transferring them, then contacting the patient and ask who they would be now seeing as their next therapist. So they do assist with that kind of trying to protect that, because they do recognize that these are confidential. So under the Consumer Protection Act, that is something that is available. So that was, the Healing Arts does have an actual statute that addresses that, but that's what the Consumer Protection Division of the Attorney General's office will assist if that is the unexpected of a solo practitioner.
So Jane, do you know the language of the Board of Healing Arts for handling situations like this?
Yes, actually, the Board of Healing Arts, under their statute, what they will do too, and they actually listed on their board's website, it's called the Patient Record Storage and Location Information.
Okay.
And it's the unexpected death of a practitioner. It's if we were to have taken action against a doctor and had revoked their license, the Board of Healing Arts sets up someplace too, because we've actually had, when I was there, we had to take a lot of the records because of unexpected, like they were revoked or something. We can't leave the records just in the clinic.
Mm-hmm.
So they actually posted on the board's website so that if a patient were all of a sudden to realize that their doctor is no longer practicing and they had no idea where their records were, they actually could go to the board's website, and it tells you who you are to call, where the records might be, and all that. So they did provide that information on their board's website. I think that might be what you asked.
Yeah, that's what the process is in general for them is what my curiosity was. This just seems like an ethical issue to me for our practitioners in the state to think about their own longevity, to prepare for accidents, for unforeseen circumstances. It just seems like it should be on the responsibility of the practitioner to be thinking about what would happen if that's why I have a will. It's why we have insurance. We have to think about those unforeseen circumstances. So I feel like this is very important. And I like the idea of an individual practitioner saying, this is who knows where these things are. This is who could help to handle it, because, so many people operate in unique circumstances. So I like the idea of this being a formalized process in some way, because there are so many, just as you named, there's so many circumstances where this can just come up. And of course, it's usually going to come up randomly. I mean, we all plan for retirement, but we're talking about all kinds of other things that can happen any day.
I work with other states all the time that license mental health, and I've never seen another mental health state licensing agency that's had a requirement for practitioners, except for the state of Oregon. And they do not have a combined, except for LMFTs and professional counselors, and they make you appoint a custodian of records. And that's the only one I've ever seen out of all the states. And I just collect these things, like whenever I get complaints, whenever I do searches, and that's the only one that I've ever seen. And they do not collect the records. They make, by statute, individuals appoint a records custodian.
Mm-hmm.
So is that in essence what we would be doing? even though it's not officially a custodian of records, but we would have a check mark and say, this is the person who I'm appointing as custodian of records for the business or for the private practice? Or do we have to make that into a reg?
This is Jane. I would have a question. I guess I can see in the unforeseen event, you know, the practitioner passes away, the practitioner goes off the deep end and just abandons everything and takes off and moves to Jamaica, or the practitioner's license is abruptly revoked because of conduct. I can see in that situation where there has to be like an immediate, and because it's the uncertainty, I guess I would question on the, as if I were, and this is from the layperson, I want my files to remain with Mary Jones because she's my therapist. Maybe I don't want Mary giving them to Bruce because, and how would I know that if Mary were all of a suddenly, I mean, the contingency plan, I can see that because I'm also wondering about like HIPAA, but yeah. I would want to, I can see in the abrupt situation, but I don't know about the planning part of it, is to say, okay, well, if something happened to me, Bruce is going to get all my records. Yeah. And maybe I don't like Bruce. I mean, I do, but maybe I don't want him to have my therapy records because those are confidential to me as to what Mary and I have discussed. Maybe I don't want them to get out to another practitioner. It's just a question, I wonder.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's a good question, and it should be worked into a disclosure state or the treatment disclosure statement.
Yeah.
But the alternative is for your records to disappear and they end up in whoever took care of your house, right? So if you die off tomorrow and someone's cleaning out your office, where are those records going to be? And that's the problem, right? So if you're seeing Mary Jones and Mary Jones dies, and there's no plan for those things. And of course, I agree with Laura. It would be nice if people did that. It would be nice if people were ethical all the time or nice all the time, but people aren't ethical all the time or nice all the time, right? And so if we're worried about you, Jane, being able to find your records, someone's got to have them, right? And I don't think BSRB is quite equipped to be the repository of record for every mental health professional in the state. So yeah, I agree. There is a HIPAA issue and it has to be disclosed to the client. But currently the client is not being served. If Mary dies, her records are, who knows? Mary, do your clients know where your records are going to go if you die?
Like, I mean, if you're in a center, so they do know that.
Well, right, you're in the center, right?
It's a quiz.
Right.
No, I mean, it's a great point. I think it was really good discussion, and echoing the same thing that Rick's saying, the HIPAA notice disclosure piece came up really quickly in the conversation of how you manage that. But I also appreciate what Jane's saying about the opt-in, opt-out piece. That is the intent of HIPAA, right? Is control over your records in many cases. But yeah, I mean, I think from a practice standpoint, makes good logical sense that there's some plan in place. And I don't think the BSRB is equipped to handle all that.
Well, and I go back to what Cindy said too, though, there's no one else that's doing this, but I think she said Oregon. So then I start thinking, are we overreaching? Is it a board? Is it our so-called business to be suggesting that our practitioners do this? Or is this, I guess that's another question to think about as well. Is it something that we can get involved in the private practice business of our practitioners?
I think that's a valid point. The other issue in terms of what was mentioned before is, what would you do if a client said, I don't want my records to go to that person? Then what? if they had to sign some kind of acknowledgement of the plan and they said, no, I'm not comfortable with that, then as a practitioner, what are they going to do?
Well, what if a client says, I don't want you to maintain my records for 5 years or until age of majority?
Well, I think it's a difference between that and a specific person, as somebody mentioned, who they might have a current relationship with that they don't want their health protected information to go to versus what you're suggesting.
Well, and I just wanted to weigh into a little bit on some of the differences between us and the Board of Healing Arts. So in looking at their process, they do have some of this formalized in statute and some of it formalized in regulation. They have it as a violation for someone to abandon their records. They have a process by which you can petition the court to name a custodian of the records. And I believe they have a trust fund that is set up to help out with costs associated with finding an appropriate custodian of the records. However, one of the big differences between us and Board of Healing Arts, they are about 6 times the size of our agency. We have about 9 employees. They have about 62. And the budget is pretty much corresponding that way too. So I think, in terms of what we're able to do, we want to be helpful in this area, though we are limited with our resources based on the differences between us and that larger agency.
Another complex issue. I mean, as a private practitioner, I keep all my records, and the business keeps all the records, just like in public. But yeah, if I wouldn't know where my records would go, but remain here in the office. But the office might close in 10 years, or who knows. It's an important issue. But my question is, I'm wondering how often this comes up. How often a former client of a deceased practitioner is needing those records, and I'm wondering if that has to do with some kind of law case that was not settled and where those records were still needed in the litigation process. And that's what I went to this documentation workshop on the ethics of documentations, and that's what was mentioned. That's for those reasons, that's what many people want the records for. Is there in some kind of law?
We get the question about once a year.
Huh?
Women will contact us maybe once a year.
Yeah, I don't see that as a huge problem. I'm not minimizing it at all.
Does that sound right, Leslie? About once a year?
You're muted.
Oh,
There you are. There she is.
There, once or twice a year.
yeah. Well,
And again, if we're the only state, I mean, there's only one other state that's really looking at
and that's
this.
for behavioral science practitioners. Doctors do it. Perhaps, it's part of, which are very different than our practitioners. But as I tend to collect information of what is like us, and I will print it off and keep it in a folder. But that's how I know Oregon off the top of my head. But with like-minded licensees, I ran across that 2 years ago, that they had that program. But that's all that I've seen. I'm not saying that that's the only state, but I ran across that. But that is the only one that I've seen. Again, Dave told you everything about our and Jane can tell you everything about the behavior about BOHA in Kansas. But it seems like about about other behavioral sciences licensees, I have not seen one except Oregon.
So we kind of circle back to the beginning then, as do we want to add, the check box with the name? And if so, then like Deb had mentioned, we want to have some lead time on that so we don't just implement it and hold up applications or renewals. So do we need to have further discussion? Do we want to decide on that, or where are we as a board? Is it as simple as what we're making it and it's a checkbox, or do we need to find out more information? I guess is my question.
I guess my question is, if you're putting it on the application, that's going to drive is it something I should be thinking about and that's why it's on there, or is it required and I have to have it? And that's sort of the backing behind the question.
I think one of the discussions has been that in order to put it on the application, it might be prudent to go ahead and add specific language to the regulations so that we can provide public notice to people that that is specifically part of their professional responsibility as a licensee under the Bsrb. And then once that's been added to the regulatory language and public has had notice, then it could be added to the applications to verify it after that. But that's just the conversation that I recall from some of the advisory committee discussion.
Dave, would that be put in unprofessional conduct?
I think it could be, or it could have its own section, but I think under professional conduct makes a lot of sense.
This is Jane. I would wonder about maybe making it its own regulation. I think it would be probably cleaner to do it that way. But at this point, if you were to add it to the application or the renewal application, I'm not even certain which one you're looking at, because I could see that would not be the same individual when you first got licensed, but it might change over the years. But right now, if they didn't answer the question, there's nothing that the board can do with them, because there's no, while ethically you are to protect the documents, I think it would be hard pressed to take any action against an individual who didn't check the box, because it's not a requirement that they have to name an individual.
Especially when they're dead. Yeah, we want to be proactive. Yeah.
So we're back at square one again. We're at an impasse here.
I guess one thing we could do is we could draft some potential regulatory language for the board to look at to see if that would be sufficient to move forward with. If that's something that you would like us to work on, that would give you a chance to see sort of what we've outlined as some of the things that might fit under professional misconduct or kind of in the same area. Is that something we could do if you'd like us to do that?
Yes, I'm seeing heads nodding. Everyone okay with that? Okay. Yes, if you could do that.
I'd be willing.
Go ahead, Laura.
I'd be willing to help on that, David, as much as you like any troubleshooting or feedback, since I'm in private practice and I actually have thought about this in great detail. So
great. Okay.
And you're familiar, KDADS requires it of private programs for addiction counseling, so they also have a policy already in place.
Okay.
I guess it's considered a standard.
Okay.
So, and I forwarded that, I think, to Leslie back 2 or 3 months ago when we were talking about it. So there's that in place as well. So, okay, thank you. Let's see, in residence educational requirements, the next one on our list.
Yeah, and so you should have a handout in your materials. At the top, it says in residence regulatory language for Bsrb disciplines. And earlier this year, the board was looking at the educational requirements as they relate to requirements of in residence for certain facilities, educational facilities. The in residence language does differ a bit between the different professions. So I asked Leslie Allen to go ahead and pull the language for the professions under the Bsrb. And also earlier this spring, the board had asked me to reach out to representatives from educational institutions. So we sent a message out on behalf of the board and collected all that feedback and provided that at a board meeting, I believe back in either April or May, for the board to review and take a look at. And that was forwarded to the advisory committees to have discussions. And so I think that's kind of the topic before you. And Leslie, Allen, if you want to add anything else on that topic, or the advisory committee's representatives could also discuss, but that's why this topic is in front of you with the highlighted in residence language. And then we have that for each of the professions.
I can tell you the differences. Addiction counselors allow for 2 courses to be in residence, and it has to be 2 practice courses. And LPC is different in that they don't require in the same physical proximity. They allow face-to-face contact with core faculty, but the core faculty can be at the campus, and then the students be at a satellite location face-to-face. The others all require in the same physical proximity. And the problem that we've been having lately is that really military has been applying, and our regulations don't allow for an online program if it's not accredited by the professional association. And some of them are still in the process of changing because they don't allow, even if they have the professional accreditation, they don't allow for all online programs.
I would say, given all of the changes we've made over this past year, this might be kind of in addition to or similar to what we've been discussing. So does anyone have a comment?
I would also add, I'm sorry, Leslie, that this change is purely in regulation. There's no statutory language that refers to in residence.
So Leslie, could you kind of go through what the change would look like? What would we need to do?
Well, we didn't have any specific change. It was actually just a decision of whether or not the board would want to change anything to allow more online programs, if there was a way to look at their quality in a different way than just saying in residence.
And we are focused a little, at least somewhat, on the military families not being able to meet the criteria. So this is coming up more and more for us. So we sort of need to make a decision on this if we could.
Yeah.
The language,
it obviously affects other people, but.
Yes, of course.
The language in the addiction counseling, where it says, present at the physical location of the institution or at any other location approved by the board, seems like it allows for some leeway there for the board to make a determination for some of these online groups, whether what an applicant might present would be robust enough to kind of meet that criteria. It at least allows some flexibility versus the either on campus or not.
Yeah, because it goes on to say face-to-face contact in that same paragraph.
The other regulations saying face-to-face contact at the location of the institution or something, so they have to be on a campus. There are programs that have face-to-face contact with core faculty that I know someone in the military had his MFT program was all the courses were face-to-face, but they were televideo, they weren't in person, but he couldn't get a license.
So we would also have to change the face-to-face contact. Is that what I'm understanding then, Leslie?
I think the location of the student is the bigger problem.
Okay.
My advisory committee was comfortable with the flexibility of the language we have now.
So Deb, can you clarify that a little bit? So you're okay with the current language as it stands in residence for addiction counseling, no need for changes?
Yeah, my only caveat is, if we have time, that I'll take it back. We didn't really talk about those discrete courses. I totally understand the need for the practicum, the individual and group counseling. I missed that when we were meeting. So need to take that back and see if they have any different thoughts than when we put this whole thing into place, whatever, 10 years ago. So that's my only caveat, but otherwise we're good. Meaning that an individual and group would not have to be face-to-face. It could be virtual.
So Leslie, I feel like I'm being a counselor. What I'm hearing Deb say is that the language should meet the requirements, and her committee approves that language. Does that limit then applicants or people from getting licensees from meeting this criteria?
I don't believe it does, because it allows the practicum to be part of that in residence course. You're always face to face in your practicum. So.
Okay.
And I think
Well,
we'd have to take this.
Go ahead.
Well, I know this is something, as Leslie mentioned, in MFT that has impacted MFT licensure, and I've not brought it to the advisory committee.
Okay. Well, then that explains it then. We'll have to let it go back to advisory committees. All right, so we will, I'm sorry, go ahead, David.
Quick question. When we take it back, is one of the things that we're asking them is, are they comfortable with the current language, or would they be comfortable with the language like that's written up for the addiction professionals, that has a little more flexibility to it, as the regs were written really back before a lot of these programs were even available?
Leslie, did you want to comment on that?
I thought it was just gathering information, and I mean, I guess if you have the addiction counselor as an example, but there wasn't anything specific that Dave and I had. It was just brought up because of the differences in education now, and then people not meeting and the military not meeting, especially now with the reciprocity law for military. The legislature is really in favor of allowing them to get licensed, and we don't have any alternative. They have to get a new degree.
Okay, so any other comments? We'll take it back to committees. Any other questions? Okay. So I think we're kind of limited on time. Do we have a hard stop at noon? Is that what I'm understanding? Yes. Okay. So, all right. So we can move forward. Anyone need to take, I think we need to take at least 5 minutes. Is that okay with everyone? 5 minutes? Okay. Let's come back at 11:20. Okay.
the Zoom picture can't decide what it
All right, welcome back. So the next thing is the board governance policy. Dave, I think you were gonna kind of give an overall view, David Fye, so if you wanna go ahead and take the reins.
And Leslie, there will be quite a few items for this, since several board members indicated they have a hard out at noon. I thought I would see what you thought about maybe passing over this item for now, and then if we're able to finish the other items on the agenda, coming back to this item.
If the board is okay with that as well, that's fine with me. So you want to go down to where do you want to go to on the agenda?
If you don't mind, we can just go to G and then just do G, H, I. And then if there is time remaining, we can talk a little bit about the board governance policy, but none of those items are as time sensitive as some of the other ones are.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you for assisting me with that, guiding us along. So let's go to G, 2020 Legislative Special Committee on Mental Health Modernization and Reform Recommendation. So workforce recommendation.
Yes.
Go ahead, David.
So about a week and a half ago, I was contacted by representatives from the Kansas Legislative Research Department. They are lead staff on a legislative committee that coincidentally I was lead staff of last year when I worked for KLRD. It's a special committee on mental health modernization and reform. They met during the 2020 interim, and they're meeting again during the 2021 interim. And when they completed their work at the end of last year, they provided a report to the legislature that was a very lengthy report. I believe it was about 150 pages. And they included a number of recommendations they submitted to the legislature. Some of those items are items that other entities could work on, or the legislature could have taken the lead on, but they have gone back, beginning their work this interim, and have identified who they believe some of those recommendations may be most appropriate for. So they asked me about a week and a half ago to look at some of those recommendations, 3 in particular, and they asked me to go to a legislative committee that is meeting tomorrow and to provide any information that I can share on behalf of the BSRB in terms of the recommendations they had in their report last year. So the first one that they had down, we were identified as a lead contributor, and then the other 2 we were listed as sort of one of many different groups that may have some work in these categories. So I wanted to let you know that I have submitted some information to that committee, and I'll be coming before them tomorrow. But that first recommendation that they had submitted in their end of the year report last year was workforce recommendation 1.1, clinical supervision hours. And it said, where applicable, reduce the number of clinical supervision hours required of master level behavioral health clinicians to obtain clinical licensure from 4,000 to 3,000 hours, similar to the reduction in clinical hours for social workers. And that was one of the items that was included in the bill that the BSRB requested of the legislature back this past spring. It did reduce the number of supervision hours for those practitioners seeking the clinical level license from 4,000 to 3,000. So I'll be prepared to talk to them about that item and let them know that that item was passed and enacted, and that is now into law. And also that the board took measures to go ahead and expedite practitioners using those new hours. So instead of requiring a change to their plans, they were able to immediately go forward with the new hours in statute. So that item is taken care of. The other 2 items they asked if I could weigh in on. Yes.
David, excuse me for interrupting. The language on that is a little strange. And so it may be the language that came right out of the recommendation, but the clinical supervision hours were the 150, 100. These are the practice hours, the professional hours required for licensure. So if the legislature, that may not matter, but it is oddly worded.
I agree. This was the exact phrasing they had in their recommendations for the year. So I'm prepared to talk about the change from 150 to 100. But in terms of their 4,000 to 3,000 hours for the social work change that was done in 2019, that's kind of what I'll point to, but I'll also mention the change from the 150 to the 100 as well. So. The second item, we were one of several groups that was asked to touch upon, and this wasn't something that was directed for the BSRB when their report came out. It just was a recommendation for the legislature. It's a workforce recommendation 1.4, workforce investment plan. And their recommendation was that the state of Kansas should make a long-term investment plan for the behavioral health system workforce by increasing funding for training, recruitment, retention, and support to effectively attract and retain high-quality staff. Specific steps include development of career ladder for clinicians, such as through the development of an associate level practitioner role, or to take action to increase workforce diversity, including diversity related to race or ethnicity, LGBTQ, and the ability to work with those with limited English proficiency. And what I'm prepared to talk about in a little bit is to the legislative committee to clarify that our role is as a public protection agency. And so our primary focus is on protecting members of the public from individuals practicing under the licenses of the BSRB. But we do understand the need to have properly trained licensed professionals that are practicing. I'll be talking about the different levels of licensure that we have underneath the different professions. One item on the idea of an associate level practitioner role, I thought I would bring that to your attention, that was one of the items they included as something for consideration, and see if you had any comments on that item in particular. In terms of to take action to increase workforce diversity, including diversity related to race, ethnicity, LGBTQ, and the ability to work with those with limited English proficiency. As I mentioned earlier, I'll be talking to them about our role as a public protection agency, that there are other associations that may have more of a role in terms of growing professions, though we are aware of the different issues involved with that. But if you would like me to say anything in addition to the legislative committee, I wanted to bring this to your attention today so that you could have a discussion, and then let me know if you'd like me to bring anything else back to that committee, or if you'd like me to provide any other update to the legislative committee. And just on the associate level licensure too, I did want to make you aware, we present those reports that have all of the different licenses. The only license that we have for an associate right now is the associate level social work license. And that is not one that we currently offer in terms of new licenses, but there is a small number, I think it's 8 individuals that have a associate level social work license that were licensed well in the past. I talked with Leslie Allen about that, and it was before her time starting with the board. So it was over 20 years ago that we had offered that level of licensure, but there is a small group that does remain. So just wanted to make sure and see if you had any other thoughts on those comments from that legislative report for that recommendation.
I guess I'll jump in here. Would there be sort of an understanding that if a different level of licensure were able to be created, that we'd have to define the scope of practice in those, right? I mean, there's a lot of work to do. The other thing that comes to mind is oftentimes this work is driven by what's reimbursable. And so, you know, that requires a lot more than what's under our purview under the board. I certainly am support of mechanisms to increase workforce, but that will only go as so far as what people can do that is a reimbursable service. It does remind me back in the old days when we had the licensed mental health tech, that was under as a nursing license that was sunsetted or went obsolete. And that was really a career path for people. And if we could be in a role that would help support some type of career path for people in behavioral health, I would certainly be interested in passing around ideas for that. Similarly, I'm not sure how our role could be in including issues with diversity unless we do more education and outreach to communities. Partnering with, again, I think of like tech schools to help people on a path, more education towards community itself and different populations. But I'm sort of talking off the cuff here because I'm trying to conceptualize what the BSRB can do in this endeavor, but I like the the ideas around it.
Yeah, I think in terms of testimony, David, I would be sure to point out that there are other paraprofessional roles now that we do not oversee, peer mentors, case managers, and that frankly, the biggest problem we have is low reimbursement rates, so that it's very difficult to keep pace with basically cost of living for these folks. They're demanding salaries that we're struggling to pay, and we're not attracting new people very well into the profession because of the low pay and certainly the tough working conditions. So that's kind of one side of that coin. I think that we need to be sure to point out there's other ways that the work gets done. And to Mary's point, if they're not going to reimburse for some level to do a certain thing, it doesn't even matter what we come up with.
I appreciate you interjecting that though, Deb, because I think as we are providing more rounded testimony, it's always nice to throw those rates in there.
I appreciate those comments, and I'll try to summarize those best. I should have mentioned this too. They have asked me to present comments on these areas in total in about 5 minutes. So I'll be hitting high points, but I did want to give you an opportunity to take a look at these briefly before I went before them tomorrow. So the next item I just want to talk to you about briefly too is another recommendation, and this was a recommendation, at least in what they had told me about a week and a half ago, like I said, is for several different groups to weigh in on. And these are some telehealth recommendations that they had provided to the legislature on quality assurance. And the recommendation they put in their report was develop standards to ensure high quality telehealth services are provided. This includes establishing consistent guidelines and measures for telehealth in collaboration with licensing and regulatory agencies, requiring standard provider education and training, ensuring patient privacy, educating patients on privacy-related issues, allowing telehealth supervision hours to be consistently counted towards licensure requirements, and allowing services to be provided flexibly when broadband access is limited. Concerning that next to last bullet point, allowing telehealth supervision hours to be consistently counted towards licensure requirements. That's something the board did address in terms of allowing those supervision hours to be over televideo. In terms of allowing services to be provided flexibly when broadband access is limited, the board did include language in there that some of those supervision hours can be done over telephone under extenuating circumstances, and allowing those supervision hours should help individuals become to satisfy their hour requirement to allow them to reach the next level of licensure. So some of those I believe I could talk about, and I know that the board has had some discussions about looking for different measures of telehealth guidelines, and I think part of that will be looking at the different multi-state compacts that have come before the board and will probably come before the board. We've had the SIPAC compact come before the board. There's one on professional counseling that's having a lot of discussion right now. There's one on social work that has just started up in terms of the discussion. And so I think as these are bringing different states together on some of these issues, I think those standards will probably start to look similar as we have some of these multi-state compacts with their rules underneath those compacts. But if you have any other thoughts you'd like me to add concerning the other issues, I'm happy to take anything else back to the legislative committee.
I think the only other thought I had was, I think it's easy for them to just throw out a term like associate level. What does that really mean? We have two professions that have a bachelor's level as the minimum with a limited scope of practice. So if you were to, I don't know if somebody's dreaming up having that for the, bachelor's level for the other disciplines. It's like, so what does that mean in terms of what they would actually do? Because clearly, if you're going to diagnose and treat mental illness or substance use disorders, you want some level of competence. Does anyone really think that that's less than a bachelor's degree? And if not, then what is it they're wanting? That what scope would they perform? And is that really all that different than case management and peer support?
Okay, well, thank you for those comments. I will let you know how that committee goes this session. I'll keep an eye on it and see the work that they're doing. But they met pretty aggressively last year, and they had smaller divisions of the group that met and brought back conversations and recommendations. So I will keep you in the loop in terms of the work that they're doing this fall.
Thank you, Dave. All right, allowing master level practitioners to test for licensed addiction counselor licenses. So I guess you're back on, Dave.
Okay, great. And Leslie Allen, you might need to help me with some of this, but as I understand it, so there is language in statute right now that allows practitioners with a master's level license to obtain a master's level addiction license by essentially using some of the requirements that they used for their master's level license, but applying to test to take the master's level addiction counselor license and then become a master's level addiction counselor. One of the issues is that there are certain individuals who would like to practice as a licensed addiction counselor rather than a master's level addiction counselor. But the language and statute does not provide that flexibility. It basically allows someone with a master's level license to test into the master's level addiction counselor, but it is actually a separate test for the LAC versus the master's level addiction counselor license. And so the conversation was, should the statute be changed to allow someone to test into the master's level, which currently is in there, or be able to test for the lower level license, that licensed addiction counselor license.
So this was discussed in the advisory committee for addiction counselors, and they were in full support of allowing this. You know, if you were around when they passed the initial law, there was no LMAC. And so master's level folks that for whatever reason didn't qualify for the clinical level, the LAC was the only option available to them. And then when they passed this, we put in the LMAC and started kind of transitioning people into that. Somehow or another, there was language put in that would not even allow someone to test at the lower level. So in the interest of expanding the workforce for people who don't necessarily aren't good test takers, et cetera, seems like an unintended consequence to keep people out of the addiction field just because they can't pass that test or don't want to take it or whatever.
Anyone opposed to that, to moving forward with allowing master level practitioners to test at the lower level, the licensed addiction counselor license? I'm seeing no one speaking up. So is that a vote, David, that we need to take, or do we just, no one's opposed?
I believe this would take, and Leslie Allen, correct me if I'm wrong, would this take a statutory change to make this change? Yes,
Oh, I apologize. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So since it's a statutory change, I think a vote would make it clear just for the record.
So I move that we change the statute to allow for master's level mental health practitioners to take the test for the LAC if that is what they desire.
I second that motion.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that's carried.
So that, when would that take into effect?
Assuming we can get the statute changed.
Yeah, so that would go into a bill that would go before the 2022 legislature. And then once that would be changed, then once it's enacted, then it would go.
Okay.
I should say if it's enacted, it is all the will of the legislature.
All right, thank you. Clarification on practitioners providing addiction counseling services in facilities licensed by KDAD.
Yes, so the Bsrb has authority over the licenses of practitioners in the 7 different disciplines. KDADS has authority in terms of licensing facilities for certain professions or practices. And so we were notified that KDADS was planning a meeting with some representatives from some of those facilities that KDADS regulates to have a discussion about some of the requests those individuals had concerning workforce issues and things like that. And so they asked if we were interested in sitting in, and so we agreed to sit in on that conversation. And they asked us some questions in the meeting concerning, so KDADS, in terms of addiction counseling, regulates who can practice in those facilities that are licensed by KDADS. And they asked certain questions of us concerning what are the qualifications for individuals to provide addiction counseling services. And so we clarified that the BSRB licenses professionals in the different disciplines, and for individuals of a certain level, they are able to diagnose and treat based on their level of licensure under the BSRB. And the level that they are able to diagnose and treat corresponds with the DSM-5. And the DSM-5 refers to the different things that they can diagnose. And one of those things is certain addictions. And I might ask Leslie Allen to kind of clarify some of the wording on this, because I believe this goes back a little ways in terms of how we clarify this issue in terms of who is able to provide what types of services. I think that there was a little bit of confusion. We've had a conversation with KDADS since that meeting to make it very clear that, you know, individuals who are licensed as addiction counselors are able to provide addiction counseling services. And just because someone can do certain level of diagnosis and treatment because of their training under the DSM, under the DSM-5, that does not make them an addiction counselor. It makes them someone, if they have the additional training in addiction counseling, that they can provide certain addiction counseling services. So we didn't tell them anything that hasn't already been in place. I think there was just a matter of kind of confusion concerning what individuals were able to do what under their license with the BSRB. So we clarified it and wanted to go ahead and bring this to you before the board to kind of let you know about these discussions. We understand that KDADS is in the process of putting out some information to clarify to certain facilities in terms of who they may be able to hire to provide certain services. But this really wasn't any kind of a change that the BSRB was making. We just said, here has been our stance based on what is in statute. And we wanted to clarify our role, but really the bigger picture is what KDADS is allows to, what KDADS licenses these facilities to be able to hire to provide certain services. So like I said, I want to bring this before you to answer any questions you might have about this topic. It's a little confusing, and I know that there was some information that was put out by KDADS that was a little bit, it didn't phrase things in the way that we prefer them to be phrased, because I think some of the phrasing was a little confusing in terms of how they were stating some of these issues. Leslie, do you have any, if I misspoke on any of these terms, Leslie Allen, could you adjust my phrasing?
Specifically, KDAD said that BSRB wouldn't allow our licensees to work in treatment facilities, which is not the case. KDADS decides that. And we've always said that any of our licensees that are authorized to diagnose and treat can diagnose and treat substance use disorders. They just weren't allowed to do it as the majority of their practice. And so when we said that, they kind of took off with it and were very, I think, very eager and thought that that was a good thing. And we're rewriting some of their policies, I think.
And I just had like a cautionary when I read that, you know, what that does to licenses for addiction counselors and if there's any repercussions from that. So it sounds like we would be opening that up, but they would not be able to practice as addiction counselors. So that clarification was really nice to hear.
Yeah, the initial message that went out from KDAS, and we don't have any control on what they put out. Unfortunately, it would have been nice if they would have talked with us about those issues and how they were choosing to phrase things, but they have a unique ability to do that. They went ahead and put out a message that sort of made it look like individuals who were not addiction counselors could function as addiction counselors. And we went back to KDAS and said, no, we want to make sure that we word this correctly. They can provide addiction counseling services, but there is a very well-defined addiction counselor license, and there's levels of addiction counselor licenses. So these people who are practicing in those facilities and providing some of those services, they may be able to qualify to do some of those things with other levels of license, but they are not addiction counselors. That is something separate. So we did go back and had another conversation with them, and I understand they're going to be putting something out that'll help clarify some of those. So I apologize if you received anything that may have been confusing on that. Yeah, we just wanted to make sure that you all were aware of the conversation and answer any questions you might have if you had heard any information about that topic.
Thank you. Any comments, questions about that, anyone? Okay, it looks like it's about 10 minutes till 12. We have a lot to unpack with the board governance policy. Would you like for David Fye to kind of tee it up for us and then have that fresh in our minds for our next board meeting? Or do you want to try to unpack some of it in the next 10 minutes? And move forward with some of that. It might take David 5-10 minutes to tee it up for us. So move forward, okay, and see how far we can get. We'll try that. Okay, no one's shaking their head no, so go ahead, David.
Okay, great. Well, you do have a copy. One is the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board Governance Policy, and then one is a little report that I made. I call it little, but it's 8 pages long, and I wanted to highlight some of the things that I think I would recommend the board consider changing, and then a few other items that I wanted to make you aware that are in the board governance policy, and then see what your will was if you wanted to keep these in there. So there's 2 different sets of things that I highlighted. And I've actually got a couple more that I was going to bring to your attention today. One of the things is this governance policy goes back quite a ways. The last time it was updated by the board was 10 years ago, back in October of 2011. I believe in terms of a board governance policy, one thing that's important to know is that the Bsrb is a little bit unique in having a governance policy. Because the Bsrb was created by the Kansas legislature, it is a creature of statute, and thus it falls primarily under the statutes and that language in terms of the authority that the Bsrb has. Secondarily, there are the regulations. And then after the regulations, there's anything that the board has agreed to be held to, which was something that this could fall under. But in terms of the governance policy, I talked to the Department of Administration and some other agencies to see, do you have something like this, just to get some other points of view on things that might be helpful to be included or not included in this. And I found that there wasn't a real consensus and there wasn't a lot of understanding of what agencies had one and didn't. So I did poll about 45 different boards and commissions, and about half responded back, and only about 5 indicated they had a document similar to this that was a voluntary thing the board had agreed to be bound by. And so we are a little unique on this. What I did find comparisons to in terms of a governance policy are more close to things like businesses. And those businesses sometimes adopt things like this as part of the things that they register with the state. So I think that's maybe some of the reason why the language is a little different than what I would recommend perhaps you keep in here. The document is set primarily into about 3 different things. 1, it's items for the board members themselves. 2, it's items for staff. And then 3, there's a section on the advisory committee. And what I personally would recommend is the advisory committee section probably be split out separately. And in terms of the other 2 documents, one thing to consider is, do you want a governance policy going forward? Some of these lay out the mechanics of how meetings will take place, but some of the other items really talk about things like board members shall do this or shall not do this. And part of that comes down to a little bit of a separation of power type thing, because board members being appointed is under the governor's office. And so if you want to look at things like best practices or things where maybe a board member should do this, or the expectations of board members, that's one thing. But when you include language like shall, you get into an issue of, okay, what are the teeth behind those type language? And so some of my recommendations kind of point to things like that. Some of it is also making things consistent. I believe this document, the last time it was modified, or maybe even before that, came from a time period where the board was meeting every month. And I think some of the language really kind of fits better if the board is meeting every month. So right now the board meets every other month, and in between that, there's advisory committee meetings and the meetings of the CRC. So some of the changes that I highlighted and recommended are, do you want to revise this language to make it consistent with the board's current practices? There's also some references to things like, with the advisory committee itself, there's some language that probably needs to be updated based upon how the advisory committees are currently formed. There are some questions to look at in terms of the advisory committees, such as the terms of board member service, what the advisory committee member service, looking at what the advisory committees should be looking for when they're reviewing the materials for advisory committee members. How much do you want to spell out in a document such as this? So that's, in a big picture sense, some of the things that I tried to identify in the report for you. As I mentioned, I gave a document which highlights things over 8 pages. There's a couple other items that I was going to talk to you about in terms of, do you want to separate some of these things out, or do you want to leave them all together as one document? I will also mention too, the document itself makes mention to a couple other documents. One, it makes mention to the statutes, which you really don't need to include the statutes in a document like that. Those are fine on their own. It also makes reference to the CRC policy, and just kind of wanted to highlight in general, those terms in the CRC policy are referenced as being 2 years as well. And so I know over the past few years, when those 2-year terms have come up, it's just kind of run into the next term. But if these really are to be 2-year terms, one question for the board is, do you want to keep these at 2 years for both the advisory committee and the CRC? Because if so, those will need to be brought back before the chair of the board to essentially be reappointed every 2 years, just to kind of formalize that up a little bit more. So I wanted to keep it somewhat brief, but most of the recommendations are included in those pages. Like I said, I have 2 little ones that I was just going to mention, but I can talk about that the next time that you meet. None of these are time sensitive, but we're just trying to, in a big picture sense, kind of formalize some more of these things, bring them more up to date with what the board currently does, and then bring some of these things to your attention to let you know those are in the board governance policy. Do you want to keep them there going forward?
As I mentioned, a lot to unpack. So where would you all like to begin? I think there's a lot that we can just start from the top, or Dave, do you want to just maybe do that?
Sure, yeah, that'd be fine. Okay, so I provided kind of a summary of how the document is structured, but we can go ahead and move past that first page in the report that I gave. On the second page, one of the potential changes is that just to clarify where this fits in terms of the board being a public protection agency, I recommended adding some language at the very beginning, well, after the mission statement. So it'd be the mission statement, and then before getting into the rest of it, adding some language that says, insofar as the board governance policy conflicts with or limits any federal or state statute or regulation, the statute or regulation controls. Just to let people know if there's a conflict between something that has a high authority, this falls under those things. The next item would be, it mentions term chair, chairman, and chairperson throughout the document, and just to sync those up and have it be chair and the same for vice chair. The third potential change It talks about the board meeting every month, and the executive director will provide a report every month. Well, the board currently meets every other month, so that's the change in the language that I would recommend to have that be reflected to every other month. And then have some language that says the executive director shall provide a report to the board at each full board meeting. So that should sync up with the every other month. I mentioned earlier that some of the shall language in terms of the integrity and the conflict of interest includes a lot of shalls. So I included those and changed those to should in the recommendations that you see on page 3 and 4. There's also some language that talks about the board member should not be under investigation of charges or complaints. That's something that board members really may not have any control over, because when we receive the complaint, we do have a duty and responsibility to investigate those. But I think the intent behind that language may be something a little bit similar to that. So I recommended, instead of saying that they shouldn't be under investigation of charges and complaints, instead to say that they should not commit acts that would lead to investigations or complaints.
Dave, I have a question about some of the shalls and the shoulds. So I'm looking at a board member of BSRB should reveal perceived conflicts of interest. Can you help me understand why that's not a shall? It's so I should do it, but I don't have to.
So I think the reason I would recommend changing it to should is to give an idea of board member expectations. The issue with shall is that if the board member should violate some of these, the question is what are the teeth? Because really it's up to the governor's office to appoint members to the board. So in terms of having members on the board, the question is, if it's a shall, what is the penalty for that? And I'm not sure that there is a penalty under the statutes or regulations that the board would be able to levy in terms of doing something to a board member in terms of that regard.
But the board could recommend to the governor to remove that. The board could recommend to the governor to remove someone.
Yes, that could be
And
something.
And if I were to engage in something so represented, my personal opinion is that of the board repeatedly, I would expect the board to recommend to the governor for my removal. Right? But if it's a should, maybe I don't expect the board to do anything about it.
Yeah, and this maybe comes down to a choice for the board, how you want to interpret this language going forward. To me, if it was something like, a lot of this language seemed to be similar to what you might find for a company. And for a company, let's say that someone does violate some of these conditions, well, there could be a vote of the board to go ahead and vote the person off of that board of the private company. But with the state, it works a little bit differently. So that's, I think I understand your point on that. And that just may be how the board wants to interpret the shoulds versus shalls. But because of the difference there and the ability to remove board members, that's why I recommend the should language. But I completely understand your point.
And I would think this board would make that decision whether, if that did happen, whether it said should or shall, we still could make the recommendation to have that member removed. I don't see that as a roadblock for us. So maybe I'm seeing that or interpreting that differently. So.
And I didn't mention this, but I did insert the word board in front of member because some of our staff sometimes can be referred to as the BSRB. So I want to make it very clear these are board member expectations, because elsewhere in the document it refers to certain staff members. So I did include that in terms of board member expectations.
Okay. So it is 12 o'clock, hard stop. Do we have another date for our next retreat board meeting? Days that you had gathered?
Yeah, so the date that would work for most members was October 25th. So that is an option. We've gone through all the other items for the board's consideration. So if you wanted to have a meeting on that day to talk about this in more detail, that would be fine. Or if you wanted me to bring this back to the next meeting of the board, the full board meeting, either way is fine with me. Just kind of wanted to know your preference on that, but That's kind of why I put this report together, so you'd have a chance to take a look at it in the event you needed to spend more time reviewing these items.
There seems to be a lot under those documents. I support having the second meeting, but that's my opinion. There's just a lot to look at and to consider.
Yeah, and we definitely would have the document to look over for a little bit longer as well, no matter which time we chose. So we'd be able to look it over. Deb?
I'm in support of having the October meeting to do this particular item, and I'm wondering if there's anything else that we need to consider for legislative packet next year. Maybe not. I just wanted to make sure we were covering everything. So that'd give folks time to think about that.
Yeah, and I should
Mary
mention
had
that.
to leave.
Sorry.
I said Mary had to leave, so I wanted to make sure everyone knew that. Okay.
Gotcha. Yeah, that October 5th, October 25th meeting would be from 1 to 4 in the afternoon. So I can send out an invitation, a Zoom invitation, similar to what we had for this meeting.
Great.
Is anyone opposed to that? Okay, then let's do that and pick up where we left off, if that would be okay.
Great.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for all your hard work.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye-bye.